Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and today we're going to discuss the disappearance of James Yoblonski from Reedsburg, Wisconsin. But before I get into the details of James's case, I want to take a quick moment for updates, just in case you haven't listened to my episode from last week, or it was about a minute and a half update. I first just want to thank all of you for listening while I took an extended break. I was really surprised by the fact that so many people were listening and subscribing during my couple month break, and it made the work that I was doing behind the scenes much more exciting. So I'm ready to have you guys hear some of that. And with that, with me coming back and with the show reaching its 2-year mark, I decided to give it a bit of a refresh. I have a new logo and hopefully my audio sounds quite a bit better. I have a better mic, and I'm still learning how to utilize its abilities, but hopefully, at least at this point, it sounds better and it's going to just continue to get better for you guys. And lastly, I have all sorts of fun plans coming up, hopefully, a handful of new voices. I'm sending my old mic around the country to my friends who live in different states, so they're going to be able to guest on the show. So please subscribe. It'd be awesome if you can turn on the notifications so that you don't miss any new episodes that are coming out. But let's go ahead and dive right into James's case, because this one's a very baffling one, and it's the disappearance of James Yoblonski. And James disappeared from Baraboo, Wisconsin in June of 2023, so very recently. And there's some bizarre and pretty unsettling things about his disappearance. And I was actually in Baraboo just a few weeks after he had disappeared, which is where I had first heard about this case from some locals who live there. So after having those conversations, so many of the locals that I had heard talking about it, were as equally baffled by it as I was once I had started doing my research. James was born on December 6th, 2009. He has 4 siblings, one of which is a half sibling. And his mother decided to divorce James's father, Bill, and she basically left all of the kids with Bill. And we know very, very little about his mother. I couldn't find even what was official confirmation on what her name is. Um, but one thing I'll say just at the top here, she has been cleared by police. So I'm not going to really go any further into diving deeper for her information. I don't know the circumstances of why she left. A lot of that is very unclear, and it seems like she doesn't have much of a presence online. But the fact that she was completely cleared makes me believe that there is some sort of alibi or something that the police have found that made it so that there was no way she had any involvement in his disappearance. And I'm just going to leave it at that. But James's father, Bill, he owned a business repairing golf carts in the Wisconsin Dells. And the Dells are only about 7 miles from where they lived in Reedsburg, Wisconsin. And it sounds like they lived a pretty simple life. He did everything he could to provide a good life for his kids. He worked hard just to make sure he was putting food on the table as a single father. But it was difficult to find more detailed information. It does seem like this family was not very into social media, so there's not a lot of public conversation about what their home life was like. But just based on the description I've heard from some locals, it was pretty simple and as to be expected for a single father who was just working hard to take care of his children. And James would disappear in June of 2023 at the age of 13. So he was very much in that in between age where parents are often debating how to monitor their kids. And I think most specifically nowadays, that comes to how to monitor them on social media. And Bill wasn't quite ready to give James his own cell phone, but he did give him an old cell phone that didn't have access to a cellular network or an iPod Touch. So either one of those situations, he could log on using Wi-Fi, but that was the only time that he could use any sort of internet functions on his device. But overall, it seems like James was a pretty normal 13-year-old from rural Wisconsin. But in the early morning hours of June 12th, 2003, he would leave his home, seemingly of his own accord. And unfortunately, he has not been seen since. He left at 12:52 a.m. He was seen on camera, kind of looked like it was in his driveway with a backpack, two additional bags, and he would get into his father's van and drive away. And I will note, I've seen the video of him leaving his house. And while he drives away, yes, he's knows how to operate the vehicle. It seems like there's definitely not a whole lot of practice going on. He's 13. Is it entirely possible that his dad may have taught him how to drive, especially with the fact that he owns a golf cart repair business, that maybe he's used to driving golf carts or other vehicles, that a transition into a car isn't that crazy to think about for a 13-year-old to make. But it did seem like he didn't quite know what he was doing. The way he just pulled off, you could kind of hear the way the engine was revving a few times, that maybe he was struggling a little bit, or timid, even maybe pressing the gas a little too hard on accident and pulling back. Not entirely sure. That's just kind of my opinion watching the clip. That really is only a few seconds. But shortly before 9 a.m., Bill would start his day. He'd go let the dog out in the morning, and he noticed that his van was gone. And so he goes and checks in on his kids, and he noticed that James is also gone. And so he starts to panic. And again, there's another video of the driveway area outside the home, and you can hear him yelling in the background that he discovers the van's gone, James is gone, and that his cell phone was gone. And James is Bill's oldest child. So none of the other kids had cell phones because, as I just mentioned, James didn't even have his own fully functioning cell phone. So he's panicking because he doesn't have another way to contact the police to report him missing because his car and the phone's gone. So he starts running around telling his other kids that they need to try to help to find a phone. And by around a little after 9, they were able to get to the police station so that they could report James missing. But by this time, so this is about 8 hours after James had left the home. By this time, they had actually already found the van along Highway 12 in Baraboo Bluffs, which I believe is 35 to 40 minutes from where James lived in Reedsburg. It was kind of hard to find the exact location of where the van was, and this area is pretty big, but from my general estimation, it'd be about that far. But James wasn't in the van, and it was found abandoned, just sitting on the side of the road. So once Bill arrived to the police station with the vehicle information, the police were pretty quickly able to piece things together and begin their search in this area around the van for any clues that could lead to James's location. And the police began to track Bill's cell phone, hoping that it would lead them directly to James. But this would actually lead them to a makeshift campsite that was about 100 yards away from Highway 12, where the van was abandoned. And I feel like I should point out, for those who are not familiar with this area, this is a pretty small highway. It is 2 lanes in either direction, so it is a 4-lane highway total, but it's still pretty rural. It's not super, super highly populated, and especially in the middle of the night, when a lot of this seems to be happening, It's not going to be highly traveled. And I don't even believe there's lights along the side of the highway. So it's going to be very, very dark and very easy to miss somebody potentially parked on the side of the road if your lights aren't shining directly at it, or somebody getting out of the car and running up the steep hill on the side of the road. You might not see that if it's still dark out. And I personally will also say I've seen many people picking wildflowers or berries off the side of the road in this area. So it's not something that's super uncommon to see a car on the side of the road or even in the middle of the night. As I was saying, it's something that you might not notice until you're much closer to it with lights on it. But at this makeshift campsite, they found some of James's belongings, including a cell phone, which is the one that they were tracking. They found some clothing and hygiene products. And this is what really set off the search for James. The police and the DNR first led the search around the area of the van and the campsite, but they didn't find any additional evidence. And so they began to ask the public for help. They started to have volunteers who were searching and firefighters who were also searching. And while the search was happening, authorities were reviewing the cell phone data and the geo-tracking information from the cell phone, and they discovered that he had traveled to the Wisconsin Dells, Lake Delton, and throughout areas of the county which I believe are pretty rural, and then back up to Reedsburg, where he lived, and then south again to Highway 12, which is where he left the car. And this is hours worth of driving. And it's unclear if he had an agenda in mind, if he had specific locations he was trying to go to. One thing that they do know is that he had stopped by his dad's business twice in the Wisconsin Dells. We're unsure exactly what he was doing there, but Bill did discover that one of his handguns that was in a safe inside of his business was missing. And I think it's important to note that it is not confirmed that James had taken this gun. From the sound of it, multiple people had access to this safe, multiple employees, and Bill had not used the gun recently, and so he was not aware if it had gone missing. I don't know what sort of case it was in either. It's very possible it was in a case where the gun wouldn't have been visible unless the case was opened. That's just my personal assumption on why he may not have noticed it missing. So it's very possible that James does not have this, but it's also possible that he did take it. And once the police heard that James was potentially armed, they actually called off the firefighters and volunteer searchers for their safety. The police were unsure what James may be capable of, and they didn't want to put anyone at risk. So even though they called off all of these people from helping search, they called in neighboring towns and counties' law enforcement to help them search, people who are trained on how to deal with a weapon and deal with somebody else having a weapon and potentially risking harm. And over the next few days, the search continued with very, very little new evidence. Search dogs were brought in, drones and Black Hawk helicopters, but unfortunately, it led to no new leads on his location. But they did find something that was potentially a second campsite. And it doesn't sound like there was any items that they found that specifically had belonged to James like they had at the first. But it did seem like he was building a shelter, and this shelter was actually featured in a book that they believe he had with him that was a survival guide. And it was specifically this type of shelter and how to build it that was explained within this book. So it seems like it is a good possibility that that was indeed James, but it really kind of just adds a whole lot more questions to this case and why he would do this and what's kind of his end game here. What's his plan? But unfortunately, this also didn't provide any leads to where James may be at this point and how to find him. And on June 16th, 4 days after James disappeared, the ground search was called off. The area that they were searching is very rough terrain, and the area is very heavily wooded. The sheriff is even quoted saying that it was difficult for his deputies to see each other when they were 6 to 8 feet apart during their search, and that there were a handful of injuries for the people who were helping search. And the sheriff felt like he needed to make a call to just call off the search for the safety of those trying to help to find James. And I can tell you, I've been to this area many, many times. One of my best friends lives in Baraboo, and it is a very rough terrain. It's very, very rocky. There's a lot of bluffs and cliff edges. It is very heavily wooded. This area of Wisconsin has probably the most uneven terrain due to the glaciers that had come through the state and basically ripped through the rock, and it's very, very jagged. Even the area where that first makeshift campsite is described as being up an incredibly steep hill that sounds like it was pretty difficult for some of the authorities to get to and be able to investigate. So I understand why the search was called off. It's such a shame that it was only 4 days, but with multiple injuries, I do understand it. But during those first few days, analysis were also working on reviewing Bill's cell phone and also began interviewing James's friends and classmates. All of his friends and classmates said that they were really surprised that James would do this, and they described him as quiet and shy. But when asked if he may be suicidal, they all said that they didn't believe so. Also, none of them had mentioned specifically that he had made mention of him wanting to leave. A few people did say that he had made comments about wanting to live off of the grid, but no specific plans to do so. And as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, he did have some survival books, and Bill says that they were potentially missing. And I don't exactly know the reference to potentially missing. My assumption is maybe Bill didn't know exactly what books he had. And so maybe there were a couple left at home. Maybe there were a couple that James could have taken with him. Maybe some of them were library books. So again, Bill might not be confident on exactly what he had access to. But when the police looked into those specific claims, they didn't find any additional information. But on a Facebook post by the Sauk County Sheriff's Office, some people were commenting that on James's Snapchat shortly before he disappeared, there was some potentially disturbing comments that he made that may lead the police to believe that he could have taken his own life. And from my understanding, there's no video that goes with the audio, but the audio from the Snapchats, James is saying, quote, "For everyone who cares about me, it's not their fault. It's no one's fault. It's my fault." So we don't really know what this is in reference to. I don't know if there's additional videos that we don't have access to. I do think it's possible. There is another clip I'll share in just a moment, but we're very confused on this. At least me as an outsider, maybe people who know James, this might not be as odd. He is a 13-year-old, and there's a lot that a 13-year-old goes through mentally with just still being a mentally healthy kid. And James had clearly been through a lot. His mother left. His father was a single father taking care of multiple children. So he may have been under a lot of mental stress. And unfortunately, we can only try to understand through retrospect at this point. But he, in either another video or potentially the same video later on, he would also say, I'm not processing anything. My brain is, something has happened to it. And I think that kind of goes along with the previous statement where he's not explaining himself, but we can very clearly tell he's going through something. And it makes it very difficult for us to then predict what he may be doing next because we just can't understand. And I believe these videos were recorded while he was in the van shortly before he abandoned it. I could be slightly wrong on that. It was kind of difficult to find specific timeline information in this case. A lot of this I had to do a bit from memory. I talked to my friend who lives in Baraboo, and she kind of gave me a little bit of her insight and what she remembers from the local perspective. But when I tried to look up timeline specifics, I either found articles that really didn't break down the timeline or some specific things that were definitely important to the story as a whole, but not super specific for me to put together a minute by minute timeline. So I could be wrong on that, but from a few things I read, it sounds like that was in the van that was recorded. And so it's understandable. The police are beginning to believe that there is the possibility that James may be suicidal after he had potentially stolen his father's handgun and posting these fairly cryptic messages on Snapchat. And I think that there's definitely the understanding that he was not in a good mental place. And his family and friends have very much said that they don't believe that he's suicidal. But as authorities, you really do still need to consider that as a strong possibility, just given the evidence that they currently do have. But authorities still, they don't have enough information, so they continue to comb through the phone. And there's really nothing new to be found at that point. And it's believed that Bill had potentially taken, excuse me, believed that James had taken Bill's phone so that he could use the hotspot on it and connect his old phone that isn't connected to a network so he could use the internet. And this is potentially why nothing was really found on Bill's phone other than the geolocation data, which they were already aware of. And Bill had said that he wasn't even aware that James had a Snapchat. So again, it would make sense that he was using this other phone, especially if he's posting these Snapchats from the van, that he's using it specifically for the hotspot reasons, not the fact that he just needed a phone. And potentially then why he left it behind. And the van was also thoroughly searched. There was no evidence that anyone other than James had driven it that night. And there are some mixed reports on exactly what time it was left on Highway 12, kind of as I was just mentioning with the Snapchats. I heard a couple podcasts discuss a time, but I struggled to find confirmation that I felt comfortable with. But let's just go through this as an example with kind of the basics of what I heard from different podcasts. Was that the van was potentially left there 4:45 to 5 a.m. early in the morning, so about 4 hours after James had left home. And when a vehicle is found on the side of the road, it's tagged. So the police will come by or it'll be reported. So the police come by and see that it's abandoned. They put a sticker on the window. Usually they'll wait a little bit if the owner comes back, for example, if you run out of gas or something. and you need to walk to the nearest gas station, they'll leave it for a bit of time. And if it's still not picked up after a little bit, it'll be towed. And that's exactly the kind of the position that they were in with the van. There was still a sticker on it. And by the time Bill got to the police station at 9 a.m., it was still on the side of the road. It hadn't been picked up yet, it hadn't been towed. And so it was basically exactly where it had been, which would hopefully lead to more evidence, less contamination of evidence. But unfortunately, there was nothing really found with the van. It There was no sign that there was anyone else driving the van. And with that timeline, it then creates a lot of questions. We do know that Bill drove around. I listed all of those different places earlier throughout the county, and um, he he spent so much time going from place to place and just kind of what seamlessly was aimlessly driving around. What could he have been doing? I think that's kind of one of the biggest questions that we have within this case. And we know he stopped by the business twice, but there was so much other time. Was he waiting for something? Was he trying to make a decision and just using the time to drive around? Um, One big question I also have is how much gas was in the tank when it was abandoned? And is that why he had chosen to leave it at that point? I don't really have much more to that. It's very much a curiosity of mine. I also wonder if James could have been at that campsite when the vehicle was found. I feel like in all likelihood the vehicle was found, because if he had abandoned it around 4:30, 4:45, and it was found around 5 a.m., he was just in all likelihood there. Where else could he have gone in that time? But also, could he have been there at 9 a.m. or a little after, once Bill reported him missing? Because one interesting thing is during the search, they did find that second campsite. And so I wonder if he left one to go towards the other. One thing I wish I knew is how far that campsite was from each other. The two were from each other. I would assume, due to the fact that they do believe that that second one was him, that it was pretty easy walking distance. Might be rough terrain, but distance-wise, not too far. But throughout the next weeks and months, Bill would really be scrutinized by the public. People would speculate that he was involved in his son's disappearance, and I don't really know the reasons for this. This is something that I heard as the local rumors from people I know who lived there, that was kind of going around town. And I really I don't understand, and that was my question when I first heard this, and the person I was asking didn't have an answer either. They were just sharing with me things that they had heard, but I don't think that there was anything specific that led people to believe that, other than the fact that this is just a very bizarre case that has a lot of questions associated with it. But while people are scrutinizing him, Bill is mortgaging his home so that he could offer a $10,000 reward for information that led to where James is. And Bill also did polygraphs when the sheriff's department asked, and he passed with seemingly no issues. And it was after this that the sheriff's office made a public statement saying that while technically it is possible that Bill could be involved, the fact that there's no tangible proof that he was, and that he seems to be truly telling the truth. He passed the polygraph. He's working hard to raise money to help find his son. They believe that Bill has no involvement in his son's disappearance. And it was around this time that the police had publicly said that they were starting to run out of leads and asking for the public's help. The narrative that they were discussing is that James had likely made the decision on his own to leave home and live off the grid. And Bill openly disagreed with the authorities. He said that he believed that James was in contact with somebody who helped him, and that this person could have persuaded or coaxed James out of his home. And in addition, he believes that James was not suicidal because he had made plans that he seemed to be excited about doing some of his favorite things that summer. They had plans even just later that month to go fishing and camping. And then that fall, James seemed to be incredibly excited to be able to go hunting for the first time. And he was going to be able to go with Bill just on his own as some father son time, which he seemed to be incredibly excited about. So he didn't feel that James potentially being suicidal or potentially leaving home of his own free will to go live what in reality is a very difficult life living off the grid, especially somebody who's starting from scratch, that he doesn't believe he'd make that decision. But in August of 2023, nearly 2 months after James had disappeared, the sheriff's office provided an update. They discovered that James had searched many rural areas in the state of Wisconsin and out of state, and they believe that these were searches for him to begin his process of living off the grid and figuring out where he wants to go and kind of conducting his own research. And the authorities did conduct many different searches in these areas that he seemed to be searching online, and they didn't find any information that showed that James had been in those areas. And they discovered that these searches, I believe some were on Bill's phone that James had taken, plus a school issued device. I'm assuming this is a laptop, but everything I saw just said device on it. But it seemed that he was doing some pretty thorough searches of different places. I've heard most specifically in Minnesota. So they think that he was trying to get himself out of state. But that leads to so many more questions because if that is the case, how did he leave the state? He left the car behind. So, in all likelihood, someone would need to be helping him. But the police have also very clearly come out and said that they don't believe there's any criminal activity involved in this case, which is something that I find very interesting with the idea that he's leaving states. Because also, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the geography of Wisconsin, where we're talking about here, Reedsburg, Baraboo, the Dells, it's basically directly in the center of the state of Wisconsin. You're not near a border where it's pretty easy to cross state lines if you don't have a vehicle. So, if that is his intention, that he is wanting to cross state lines, he's going to need help. Um, so this is one of the very, very baffling cases. And one thing I'm incredibly surprised about with this case is that it's not more widely discussed. I know I've heard a lot about it just because I don't live far from the area. I have friends who live directly in that area. Because I was getting pictures right after I started talking about it with my friends. I was getting photos sent to me of kind of the vehicle searches or the searches in the area and all the cars kind of parked along the side of the road. And it's just such a baffling case. I'm surprised it's not discussed more. I know I did see a really long thread on Web Sleuths about it, but all of the news, for the most part, are just local news stations. I did see one UK article, but almost everything is just local news stations reporting this. And I definitely think that this case could use more coverage because it's incredibly baffling. And that's really kind of all the information that we have on James's disappearance. And looking at this case, I think that there's really essentially three main possibilities. And I think that a lot of you can kind of guess where I'm going with this. The first one, which is kind of what we've already discussed, a little bit, is that somebody was helping him and not necessarily help him to live off the grid, even though that's certainly a possibility, but somebody who's essentially grooming him. They're coaxing him out of the house, as Bill has discussed and as Bill believes, and this could be to do him harm. This could be trafficking. This could be all sorts of nefarious reasons, and very terrible and tragic things could come from that theory alone, but there's no evidence of it that we've seen so far, and so it's even kind of difficult to speculate because of that. But another theory, which I really just kind of mentioned, is somebody helping him, but somebody helping him to actually live off of the grid. And that's definitely a possibility, I feel like, especially if it's somebody that's not too far from his age. Somebody else who has the same ideas, who wants to live off the grid. One thing I remember, this is a little bit of a tangent, but also kind of related. I remember when I was in the 4th grade, we read this book called My Side of the Mountain. And I would have only been a couple years younger than James in the 4th grade. And that book, if none of you have read it, it's about a 12-year-old boy who was living with a large family. He had like 7 or 8 siblings, and they were in a New York City apartment, and he hated it. He wanted to leave, so he decided that he was going to go find his great-grandfather's abandoned farm in the Catskills. And he decided he was just gonna leave and try to start over. And this is a children's novel. So it did end up with a good message, but not one that you might expect. It went into how difficult things were. It really did show his struggles. If I remember, at one point he ate the wrong berries and was incredibly sick. He struggled with his shelter, keeping warm, but he met a lot of people along the way who helped him. He would go into town on occasion and go to the library. Um, he seemed like he really was enjoying his life that he had created for himself. And in the end, his parents find him and they agree that they should move out of the city, and they go to live in the general area where he was camping out. And he's sad that he no longer has his like solitude and isolation, despite being happy that he can see his family again. And I remember in our class, there was the discussion of, is that is that kind of appropriate for a 12-year-old? And we were kids at the time, but I remember thinking like, wow, like that's kind of a dark outlook on him. Like, oh, I was happy to see my family, but I kind of liked being alone better. And I wonder if there could be some sort of influence kind of along those lines. That book was mandatory reading for us in the 4th grade, which would have probably been a year or two younger than when James disappeared. I was probably 11 reading that. And I just wonder if there's sort of outside influences like that. And we discussed something very, very similar in the Aisha degree case. So just kind of something that was running through my head with that. But then the last theory, which I really hate to admit, is, I think, the most possible theory. And I think it could be a combination. of the second and third theory that I have was that he took his own life. Those Snapchat videos, I think, are pretty telling, but I do think that they could be telling in two different ways. I think that they could be telling in the aspect that he wanted to end his own life, as I just briefly mentioned, where he didn't know what really was going through his brain. He didn't know how to handle it, and it understandably scared him, and that seemed like a viable solution. Similarly, his viable solution could have been just getting away from everything and starting over. I find it hard to believe that he felt like he could fully start over in this area, which hence that could be the searches for the other areas. But this is a difficult area to live in, and most specifically the winters. The winters are tough, and this is June that he goes missing, and maybe his plan is to get himself out of the state by the time winter rolls around. But unless there is a guaranteed plan, that could be so difficult. As I said, this is in the middle of the state of Wisconsin. It's not easy just to get himself across state lines and continue traveling without additional help. So I really I don't know what happened here. Authorities do believe that he left home with it on his own free will with the plan to live off the grid. They say that they don't believe there's foul play involved in his disappearance. And as I mentioned, Bill disagrees very openly. But we just don't know anything. And at this point, James is 15 years old. He's still incredibly young. And I would love to see at least some answers to know that he's hopefully safe. If he did make the decision to live off the grid, I hope that he was successful in doing so. Because even with that decision, if that's really what he tried to do, things could still go incredibly wrong. And his life is still in danger if that is the case. So, if anyone has seen him, please contact the sheriff's office. James is 5 feet, 11 inches tall, around 120 pounds. He has blue green eyes, brown hair, and a scar on his neck. And if anyone has any sort of information, please call the sheriff's office at 608-355-4495 or Crime Stoppers at 1-888-847-7285. That's 188 tip sock. I'll have that all in the show description for you guys. I would really love to see some answers come to this case. I know a lot of people really would. I know I went on a few different tangents here, but I have so many thoughts because I've been closely following this case for about a year and a half now, and I don't really have any new information. But I hope that you all enjoyed this case today, and I hope that you come back in 2 weeks for the next one. You can follow us on your favorite podcast app, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, and I will talk to you later. Thank you.